In 1999, Harvard University was renovating Holden Chapel, a building that had been in place since 1744. During the renovation, they accidentally crashed through the wall of a cistern in the basement, a brick cistern or dry well, and out of this well came an avalanche of bones. Very clean human bones. Some of them had been sawn and some of them had pieces of metal embedded in them. There was also a great deal of debris that looked medical, like pieces of broken glass, possibly broken test tube. But most of it, human bones. They brought in an archaeologist, and she went over the remains and found out that instead of being the work of a very tidy serial killer, this was actually just the disposal area for human remains from the medical school, which used to be partly housed in Holden Chapel. After the students were done learning all that they could from the cadavers, they would need some place to dispose of the cadavers, so they'd been putting them into a dry well in the basement and leaving them there. It worked just fine for the time. You won't find the bones there now. They've been taken out and respectfully reburied at an undisclosed location. But the point remains that in order to learn human anatomy, you have to be able to study the human body. And medical students, down the ages, have often had to study human cadavers, and then they or their servants have had to figure out how to safely dispose of the human remains. Back in the early days of Harvard Medical School, students were responsible for bringing in their own cadavers. If you want to learn anatomy, you're going to have to find a body to learn it on. That eventually changed to a process where the school is responsible for the cadavers, to the extent that in the middle of the 19th century, the janitor's job description included occasionally being responsible for procuring cadavers for the students. He made $25 per cadaver, which is pretty good money for 1849. And his job description would include getting rid of human remains safely after the students have done the dissection that they need to do, or after the body has begun to go bad. By 1849, the medical school wasn't housed in Holden Chapel any longer. It had moved across the Charles River. On the Boston side of the river, it had a new property on North Grove Street. The property had actually been donated by a philanthropist called Dr. Parkman. More about him in a bit. And the new building had every modern appointment. It had running water from the Cochituate Reservoir, which was the new big thing in the city. It also had incinerators where the janitor would need to dispose of the spoiled or already used human remains once the students were finished. It had dissection rooms, laboratories, lecture halls, and it had servants' quarters built into the basement, which is where the janitor in place at the time that this story takes place was living with his wife. Our janitor is Ephraim Littlefield. His wife's name is Caroline. They're interesting characters. The Littlefields are described as swamp Yankees in all of the sources that I could readily find. Swamp Yankee is a pretty insulting term on the face of it. It literally means a New Englander who's so poor they can only farm in places like the swamp that no one else wants. But with that said, I usually hear it used as an affectionate term of self-deprecation by people around here. So, Ephraim Littlefield has actually a quite well-paying and good job as a janitor, procuring human remains, cleaning up human remains, helping to lay out experiments and dissection projects for the students, doing the bidding of the professors, and he and his wife have an apartment in the basement of the building that they work in. In 1849, during the time that Ephraim Littlefield was janitor, a horrible event took place at Harvard Medical School. The lead players were two men who no one would have thought would be mixed up in such an event. They were men in their 50s. They were both doctors. They were married, they were fathers. They were both from good families, as they used to say. And one of the players was Dr. Parkman, the wealthy philanthropist who had donated the land that the medical school had been built on. Dr. George Parkman was a well-known man about Boston. He was a Boston Brahmin, which is the local name for families extremely eminent and extremely wealthy, so much so that they were practically royalty. Parkman's family home was on Beacon Hill, and you don't get more eminent than that around these parts. He had trained as a doctor. He was a specialist in mental illness. His published works all had to do with the humane treatment of the mentally ill. He was one of the philanthropists who donated a lot of money for McLean Hospital to be built. He wanted to be the superintendent, but that didn't work out for him because he had donated so much money that it would have looked like buying the appointment for himself. He was also super recognizable because he was very tall and skinny. And when he walked, he thrust out his chin, had a little bit of an underbite, and he would usually wear a tall silk hat. And he walked everywhere. This was because he was either too careful with his money or too stingy, depending on whether you like the man, to take a cab or keep a carriage. And the reason he had to walk a great deal was that he was a landlord. By the time that our story takes place in 1849, he'd retired from practicing medicine, and he was making most of his money, and there was a lot of it, as a landlord. He would collect his rents in person on foot, and he was extremely careful to collect all of the rents that he was due. So a lot of people would have known him by sight. And on Friday, November 23rd, 1849, he kept an appointment to go to the Harvard Medical School and meet up with our other lead player, Professor Webster. Dr. Parkman is going there for an unpleasant reason, and he knows he's going to have an awful conversation when he gets there. Professor Webster owes him a huge amount of money. Professor John Webster, he's not a Boston Brahmin, but he is from a good family, as they say, and he is well-liked, has a wide circle of friends. A lot of them are the same friends as Dr. Parkman has. One of them is Fanny Longfellow, wife of the famous poet, who I'll quote from later as she has a lot of opinions on the things that happened on this day. That's all down the road. Professor Webster is in debt up to his eyeballs. He got into debt trying to have a family mansion built, and he lost a lot of money over that. He hasn't been able to get out of debt since. He just can't make money matters work out for himself. He's borrowed money from a lot of friends. At this point, he has alienated multiple friends, borrowing tremendous amounts of money and then not paying it back. And he has been reduced to a system where he's asking his other friends for money in order to pay the first friends back. This is really not going well for him. A lot of people are actively angry at him now, and top of the list is Parkman. Some years ago, Webster borrowed nearly $500 from Parkman. He wrote him an IOU. Parkman still got that note. Webster hasn't paid it back despite the fact that we are long past the date when he was supposed to repay the debt. Instead, he asked Parkman for more money, which takes the amount to more than $2,000. And as collateral on this loan, he put down his mineral collection, which was actually quite valuable to the right people. Theoretically, Parkman could take that mineral collection if Webster didn't repay the debt. In fact, Parkman recently found out that Webster put down that same collection as collateral on at least one other loan from another friend, making it effectively meaningless. Parkman is furious. As far as he's concerned, he's going to collect that money from Webster come hell or high water, and that will probably be the end of their friendship. And if he can't get the money from Webster, then he'll do anything he can to collect the money, including garnishing his income, personally, by hand. On the day before the Friday we're talking about, Parkman went to the Harvard box office where they took the tickets for Webster's lectures, which were open to the public in some cases as well as to students, and in effect told them that Webster owed him a lot of money and to hand over the box office receipts. And they did, they handed them over. It still didn't come anywhere near clearing the debts that Webster still owes, so Parkman has been invited by Webster to come to the medical school as long as he arrives sometime after 1:30, because Webster's got to lecture today and he doesn't want any of his students overhearing the conversation. The lecture ends. Parkman walks to the building. On the way there, he stopped off at a grocery store and ordered lettuce for his daughter who was feeling ill and wanted some salad. And then he went into the medical school building at North Grove Street, and he didn't come home that night. The next morning, no one had seen Parkman. No one knew what had happened to him. His family is panicking. They're asking everyone. No one's seen him. They go to the police. The police are inquiring for Parkman. He's nowhere to be found. This man is super recognizable, and yet no one seems to have seen him. The last time they can identify him being seen was Friday, and they know he had an appointment to go by the medical school and talk to Professor Webster. So the police question Webster, and he says that yes, Parkman came by and Webster repaid him the debt. When Parkman left, he said that he was going to the city clerk's office to record that the debt had been repaid. And that was the last that they saw of one another, so unfortunately Webster doesn't know what happened to Parkman after that. There's a tremendous reward offered for the safe return of Parkman. His family offer $3,000 for his safe return. Nothing doing, no one's seen him. There are some anonymous letters written to the police claiming to have leads on Parkman being alive and seen somewhere. None of these leads work out. No one who can actually come forward has seen Parkman. Also questioned by the police, Ephraim Littlefield. He hasn't seen Parkman either. He knows he entered the building, but he wasn't paying attention to when he left. And this makes Littlefield pretty nervous because he looks like potentially a suspect, potentially of having murdered Dr. Parkman. I mean, they can't find Parkman. No one knows where he is, and he would have been likely to be carrying a huge amount of money on him in cash at the time because of the whole collecting rents in person. Littlefield is a janitor in a building with a tremendous amount of capacity for disposing of bodies. He is starting to wonder if he is going to be blamed for making Parkman disappear. And he's starting to wonder whether Professor Webster suspects him of destroying Dr. Parkman after murdering him. The reason being, Webster is grilling him with questions about what he saw and when he saw it. Webster wants to know whether Littlefield saw Parkman enter the building. What time did you see him come into the building? When did he leave? Are you sure you didn't see him leave? No, are you sure you didn't see him leave? Did you hear him say anything while he was here? Either to me or anyone else. And Littlefield can only answer no. He didn't actually see anything. He didn't see when Parkman left. He didn't hear anything that got said while Parkman was present. Webster grills him repeatedly on this and then walks away, leaving Littlefield rattled because this is the longest conversation they've ever had. They have been in the same building working in very different areas for years, and normally Webster would never say anything to Littlefield except if he needed him to do his janitorial duty. Parkman still isn't turning up. Webster, far from seeming to be hostile to the Littlefields, gives them money to buy a turkey for Thanksgiving. They do buy the turkey, but they're still baffled. They add to this the fact that Professor Webster has been behaving increasingly strangely himself. Multiple times, he's locked himself in the lab, and he won't let Littlefield in there to clean. He's locked himself in there, including at times when he doesn't have a lecture coming up or anything to prepare for. What he doesn't know is that Littlefield can see under the lab door. If you stand on the outside stairs with your head at the correct level, you can see under the door. And on one evening, Littlefield does this. He sees Webster walking around in the lab, back and forth between the fuel in the basket of kindling and the furnace in the corner. Back and forth 8 times. Littlefield just stands there and watches the shadows of his feet as he goes back and forth and back and forth. When he leaves, the lab is locked again. Webster has taken the keys with him. Webster refers to the rooms as his rooms. There's a lecture area and there's a laboratory area in there. Littlefield hasn't been allowed in there since the last day Parkman was seen alive on the 23rd. Littlefield is starting to suspect that not only did Dr. Parkman enter the building and then never leave, but that Professor Webster had something to do with it. He feels the wall between the incinerator, which is not supposed to be running, he's the one who runs the incinerators around here, and yet someone, apparently Webster, lit it at some point because it's still hot. He has to investigate this. He can't bear to not know. So he discusses it with his wife. They do hesitate over this a little bit because if they try investigating and they turn out to be wrong, they could lose their jobs. But they decide that they have to look for their own peace of mind. So on Thanksgiving Day, they're the only people in the building. Everyone else is left for Thanksgiving. Ephraim Littlefield gets a sledgehammer and he starts bashing a hole in the wall of the privy cistern, which is on the same level as their apartment in the basement. It takes hours. This is a big thick wall, it's 2 layers of brick sandwiched together. He works on it on Thanksgiving, he has to stop before the job is completely done. He goes back to it on Friday, he bashes for a while longer, then he and his wife take a break to go to a dance together. They come back pretty late at night. He sees that it looks almost complete and he thinks I could finish it tonight and then we'll know. Picks up the sledgehammer, bashes away, the wall collapses inwards, there's a big hole. It smells horrendous, there's this blast of cold fetid air coming out, it's dark in there, as dark as the tomb. He can't see anything, so he gets a lantern and he carefully puts the lantern into the hole. He leans in, he looks in. There's raw sewage everywhere, of course. On the raw sewage is lying a naked, disembodied human pelvis. Beside that is lying a dismembered human leg. Ephraim Littlefield would later say in court, "I knew it was no place for those things." He pulls his head out of the hole in the wall and he yells for his wife. They run outside, they get the next Harvard faculty member that they can, and together they go for the police. The police arrive. They look in, they're horrified and disgusted too. They delegate the policeman who has the longest arms to reach in there and get the human remains, while the other police support him on his other arm. Upstairs, in the lab, Littlefield does an inventory of every single body in the building that has a reason for being there, because the police and he want to be absolutely sure that these aren't from a cadaver that was simply improperly disposed of. Littlefield can account for every body in the building except for this one. All is as it should be except this body. He didn't bring it in, he's never seen it before. In a box, they find the upper part of the torso. They find some other body parts. I am avoiding some gruesome details here. If you find out more about this and go looking for images, please use extreme caution. The images are gruesome. They don't find the head of this body. The head will never be found. But what they do is look through the ashes in that incinerator, the one that wasn't supposed to be lit, but it was lit anyway. All the fuel in the basket of kindling to start this furnace has been used up. It's been run and run, off and on, until it's nearly full of ash and debris. And among the debris, they find a human lower jaw, with the teeth still in it. Some of the teeth have dental work. The police go to Webster's house and they don't arrest him. They ask him to come with them. They get into a carriage, and when they get into the carriage and it's heading for the Harvard Medical School building, Webster exclaims, "That villain! I am undone!" Which is going to look pretty strange when in court later on he pleads not guilty. And then before any of them can stop him, he puts something into his mouth and swallows it. It's poison. Then he begins to vomit. He got the dose wrong. It's not enough poison to kill him, just make him extremely sick. So he's in a horrendous vomiting state, and they make him examine the human remains that were found in the lab with no explanation and try to explain them. He can't or won't explain them. He won't tell the police what's going on. And they take the vomiting Professor Webster to jail and they charge him with the murder of Dr. Parkman. The ensuing trial is the trial of the century, as it were. Everyone in the greater Boston area has an opinion about this. One of the opinion havers is Fanny Longfellow, who is a personal friend of both Parkman and his family and Webster and his family. She's horrified and disgusted that Parkman has been murdered and in such a fashion. But she does not believe that Webster could possibly have done it. I'm going to read you what she says. "Of course we cannot believe Dr. Webster guilty, bad as the evidence looks. Many suspect the janitor, who is known to be a bad man and to have wished for the reward offered for Dr. Parkman's body. He could make things appear against the doctor, having bodies under his control." Professor Webster lawyers up. He tries to get eminent lawyer Daniel Webster to defend him in court. Daniel Webster won't touch the case. Professor Webster tries to get other eminent lawyer of the day, Rufus Choate, to defend him. Choate also won't touch the case. He eventually assembles a legal team of lesser lights. The prosecution has to prove 4 things. That Dr. Parkman actually is dead, that this is his body, that he was murdered, and that the murder was done by Webster. Point 1 is easy to take care of. Dr. Parkman's widow has positively identified the body, which must have been horrifying because there was not a lot of body left to identify that would be in a piece big enough to identify. Dr. Parkman had some birthmarks just above his groin, and they showed her the area of his pelvis that had the birthmarks on it, and she identified them immediately as belonging to her husband. So we have a positive ID on the body. We know it's Parkman. There's no chance he's alive out there somewhere and this is a mistake. These remains are his. Professor Webster is convicted on circumstantial evidence. He's one of the first handful of defendants in trials where circumstantial evidence is enough to convict. There are no witnesses to say, yes, I saw him murder Parkman, but the force of circumstances speaks to his having done the murder. The star witness here is Littlefield, who testifies to the strange conversation, the offer of the money for the Thanksgiving turkey, and Webster's strange behavior, locking himself in the lab, running the incinerator, and walking back and forth, putting things in the privy at night when he had no reason to be in the building. Another witness for the prosecution is a dentist. This was also a prosecution that relied upon forensic evidence because Parkman's dentist has impressions that he took of Dr. Parkman's living jaw in order to make him a set of dentures for some damaged teeth. And he brings the impressions into court and is able to show that they match up with the jaw with the teeth in it. And he can point to the dental work and say, yes, I made those. So we know whose remains they are, and yet circumstantial evidence alone is enough to convict Webster. He's found guilty. And I may say here, there is a school of thought that says that the case against Webster was never satisfactorily achieved. People still, to this day, will sometimes argue that Ephraim Littlefield did the murder. I don't actually think that that's the case. My main reason for thinking that's not the case is that Webster confessed. It was May of 1850 by this point. Webster's been found guilty, but he hasn't been sentenced yet, and he writes a full confession in great detail. It's online now, you can read it if you wish. In an effort to avoid the death penalty, his goal here is that as long as he's been convicted of the murder, he is going to try to prove that he did it on the spur of the moment and didn't premeditate it, and maybe that will save him from the noose. In the confession, he says that his motivation in asking Dr. Parkman to come to the medical school was to plead with him in private to have patience and bear with him a little longer until he could scrape the money together, and to tell him that it wasn't ready yet. His plan was to throw himself on Dr. Parkman's mercy. Parkman, for his part, thought that he was being asked there in order to receive the money. When he walked in, he said, "Are you ready for me, sir? Have you got the money?" Webster immediately started to plead with him to have patience a little longer and said that he didn't have the money, and Parkman exploded, because he was furiously angry, of course. Parkman had brought with him the notes that Webster wrote, including the mortgage on that cabinet of minerals. He takes them out and waves them in Webster's face as being worthless. And then he takes out a letter that one of their colleagues wrote to Parkman years and years ago, because Parkman was one of the people who helped Webster get the job that he now has as a professor of chemistry at Harvard. And the letter is a letter of congratulations on the good work he's done on getting Webster this appointment. Parkman says to Webster later recounts in his confession. Parkman says to Webster, "I put you into this place and I can get you out of it." So now Webster is being threatened with the loss of his job. He starts yelling back at Parkman, and the two of them stand there shouting and waving their arms. In a flash of rage, Webster picks up the nearest blunt instrument. It's a stick of wood. He grabs it up and smashes Parkman on the side of the head with it. Parkman topples to the floor. As far as Webster can tell, he dies on impact. There's blood coming out of his mouth. He's not breathing. Webster checks on him. He tries to use ammonia smelling salts to bring him around. Nothing. No vital signs. Webster says that he looked him over and tried to revive him for 10 minutes. There was no response. Dr. Parkman is dead on the floor of the lab of the man who had a very valid reason to hate him and want him dead. And the doors aren't locked. Webster instinctively runs over, locks all of the doors. And as he says in the confession, "In my horror and consternation, I ran instinctively to the doors and bolted them. And then, what was I to do?" Professor Webster hauls Parkman's body into the sink. He gets a knife. He cuts off all of Parkman's clothes, and he cuts up Dr. Parkman. It's grueling hard work. It takes hours. He's at this all afternoon. He cuts up Parkman into pieces, and he gets the furnace going nice and hot. He puts Parkman's head and viscera in there, and he keeps it blazing. The idea is to reduce the head to a condition where it will never be recognized. And as best he can think in the moment, he's going to dispose of the whole body in this way. There's too much body to burn all at once, so he is going to have to hide some of it and either pass it off as specimens of the medical school that are supposed to be there anyway, or hide it somewhere no one can find it and burn it at a later date. So he drops some of it down the privy with the intent of fishing it back up afterwards. And he puts some of it in a box. He burns the clothes. The only item of Parkman's that he doesn't try to burn or destroy on the spot is Parkman's watch. He pulls that out of the waistcoat pocket and then burns the waistcoat. In the sink, he turns on the Cochichuit water, as he puts it, which he leaves running all night long. So the body will be submerged under cold water and hopefully it will preserve it for longer. Then he locks up the lab, takes the keys with him, and he goes home. And he says, of the watch, "I took it and threw it over the bridge as I went to Cambridge." So that watch is somewhere at the bottom of the Charles River, presumably to this day. Professor Webster regulates his own emotions, goes home, and goes with his family to a dinner party at the home of some friends, the Treadwells, and while he's there, he appears to be his usual jovial self. He manages to maintain his jovial manner over the ensuing days, even when questioned by the police. He even goes to the brother of the man he murdered and explains to him that he did speak with Dr. Parkman on the afternoon Parkman seems to have disappeared, but that Parkman was there for Webster to repay the debt, and Webster had repaid it, in fact. The confession does not actually spare Webster execution. He is sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. In August of 1850 this takes place. Hundreds of people are watching as it happens. Professor Webster has made himself the most hated man in Boston, and a lot of people want to see him die. Anybody who has a house that overlooks the Leverett Street jail is in the windows or on the roof, or they're renting out space in their windows or on their roof. The rooftops are crowded with hundreds of people, and Professor Webster is hanged. No one knows what was done with his body. The reason being, as he was the most hated man in Boston, the public authorities don't want him to become the focus of people making pilgrimages to his grave in order to defile it. So he was buried, but we don't know where. And that is about it. One of the few spots of kindness in this whole sordid, awful mess is that the widowed Mrs. Parkman, who must have been an unusually considerate person, took up a collection among her wealthy friends to raise money for the Webster family. The now widowed Mrs. Webster and her daughters are in a horrible position because they're still in debt and now they're all bereaved in the most horrible way, and their family reputation has been dragged through the mire. So Mrs. Parkman got them some money to get back on their feet with. Speaking of money, Ephraim and Caroline Littlefield collected that $3,000 reward because, after all, they had led to the return of Dr. Parkman. He wasn't alive when he was returned, but that wasn't their fault. $3,000 went a long way in 1850, and so they retired and lived comfortably on the proceeds for the rest of their lives. "'Tis said he last was seen to enter the college door.